The morning sun had barely risen when Andrew pulled up to the large corner house with his landscaping truck. The property stood out on the street, not because it was beautiful, but because it needed so much work. Overgrown bushes stretched across the walkway, weeds poked through cracked stones, and what was once a garden had become a small jungle of its own. Andrew checked the address one more time on his phone. This was it, the biggest job his small company had landed since he started his business 3 years ago. Mrs. Wilson, an elderly woman who had recently lost her husband, wanted her yard completely redone. She'd seen Andrew's work at her friend's house across town and specifically asked for him. "This could really put us on the map," Andrew muttered to himself as he stepped out of his truck. The neighborhood was the kind where people had money, nice cars in driveways, professionally maintained lawns, and houses that looked like they belonged in magazines. Andrew had grown up on the other side of town, where yards were small and people did their own landscaping if they did any at all. He wiped sweat from his brow and grabbed his clipboard. The morning was already getting hot, promising another scorching summer day. Andrew was glad he'd decided to start early. He pulled out his measuring tape and began walking the property, jotting down notes and taking pictures with his phone. He needed to document everything before he started tearing things out. 7 bushes to remove. Stone pathway needs complete resetting. Sprinkler system probably hasn't worked in years, he mumbled as he wrote. Andrew had learned the business from his uncle, who had taught him everything from how to price jobs to how to deal with difficult clients. Document everything, his uncle always said. People forget what they agreed to. Mrs. Wilson had been clear about what she wanted, something low maintenance but beautiful with flowers that would bloom at different times of the year. Her husband had always taken care of the yard, and after he passed, it had become too much for her. Andrew had drawn up plans that he thought she would love. A mix of native plants that wouldn't need much water, a small seating area where she could enjoy morning coffee, and solar lights that would make the walkway safe at night. As Andrew crouched down to examine the soil quality, he felt a sense of pride. 3 years ago, he'd been working for someone else, taking home barely enough to pay rent. Now he had his own truck, his own tools, and his own growing list of clients. This job would help him hire another worker, maybe even buy that second truck he'd been saving for. He was so focused on his work that he didn't notice the woman watching him from across the street. She stood at her window, curtain pulled slightly aside, phone in hand. To her, Andrew wasn't a business owner checking a job site. He was a stranger in a neighborhood where everyone knew each other, and he didn't look like he belonged. Andrew stood up and walked toward his truck to grab some tools. He wanted to check how bad the drainage was in the corner of the yard where water seemed to collect. As he reached into his truck bed, he heard a door slam. Looking up, he saw a middle-aged woman with her arms crossed marching directly toward him from the house across the street. Her face was set in a frown, her walk purposeful. Andrew had seen that look before. He took a deep breath and put on his most professional smile, the one his uncle had taught him to use when dealing with people who made assumptions. The clipboard in his hand suddenly felt like a shield. "Good morning," he called out, keeping his voice friendly but firm. He gestured to his truck where his company logo was partially visible under a layer of dust from yesterday's job. The woman didn't return his greeting. Instead, she held up her phone, making sure he could see it. "What exactly do you think you're doing here?" she demanded, her voice loud enough that a few birds scattered from a nearby tree. Andrew could tell from her tone that this morning was about to get a lot more complicated than he had planned. Andrew kept his smile firmly in place as the woman stopped just a few feet away from him. He'd been in situations like this before and knew staying calm was the best approach. "Good morning, ma'am. I'm working on Mrs. Wilson's yard today," he said, gesturing toward the house. "I own Greenleaf Landscaping." The woman, with her perfectly styled hair and expensive-looking jogging suit, looked him up and down. Her eyes narrowed at his dirt-stained work clothes and the cap he wore to keep the sun off his neck. "Mrs. Wilson didn't mention hiring anyone," she said sharply. "And I know everyone she hires. I've lived across from her for 15 years. Andrew nodded patiently. "She just hired me last week. I can call her if you'd like to confirm." He reached for his phone, but the woman stepped closer. "Don't bother. I'd already texted her and she's not answering, which is suspicious in itself. She always answers my texts. The woman held her phone tighter. "What's your name?" "Let me see some ID." Andrew took a deep breath. "My name is Andra, and my business card is in my truck. My ID is personal information that I'm not required to show to anyone but police, ma'am." The woman's face flushed red. "Well, that's exactly who you'll be showing it to then." Before Andrew could respond, she had already stepped back and was dialing on her phone. He felt a familiar sinking feeling in his stomach. He'd hoped neighborhoods like this would be different, but some things never changed. "Yes, hello? Police?" The woman's voice suddenly rose in volume. "There's an unknown man at my elderly neighbor's property. He's refusing to identify himself, and I'm concerned for her safety. She's not answering her phone." Andrew shook his head in disbelief as the woman continued, her description of him making it sound like he was in the middle of a robbery rather than standing in broad daylight with landscaping equipment. "Yes, he's a large black man in his 30s. He's claiming to be some kind of gardener, but Mrs. Wilson never mentioned hiring anyone new. She's very vulnerable since her husband died." 2 houses down, a garage door opened, and an older man stepped out, coffee mug in hand. He looked curiously toward the commotion. Andrew gave a small wave, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. "Ma'am." Andrew tried again. "I have a signed contract in my folder here. Mrs. Wilson hired me to completely redo her yard. You can see my truck right there with my company logo." "Stay where you are," the woman said loudly, ignoring his explanation. "The police are on their way." Andrew felt his heart rate increase, but he kept his voice steady. "That's completely unnecessary, but I'll wait right here. I have nothing to hide." He pulled out his phone. "I'm going to call Mrs. Wilson myself." "Don't you dare disturb her," the woman snapped. "She's probably scared with you prowling around her property." By now, another neighbor had come outside, a woman walking her small dog. She stopped to watch the scene unfold, keeping her distance but clearly interested in the drama. Andrew dialed Mrs. Wilson's number, but it went to voicemail. He remembered she had mentioned something about a doctor's appointment early that morning. Great timing. "Look," he said, turning to show the woman his clipboard with the detailed landscaping plans. "These are the designs Mrs. Wilson approved. I'm just here to take measurements before my crew arrives tomorrow." The woman refused to look at the papers. "Anyone can make up fake documents. We'll let the police sort this out." Andrew could hear sirens in the distance now. He'd done nothing wrong, but his stomach twisted with anxiety. He'd been through this before, trying to do his job only to have someone decide he didn't belong. The difference was that now he had his own business to protect, and a confrontation with police could damage his reputation regardless of the outcome. He pulled up his work email on his phone, finding Mrs. Wilson's messages confirming the job and the start date. He also had photos of them together at her kitchen table, going over the plans. He hoped it would be enough. The police cars turned onto the street, lights flashing. Andrew took another deep breath and stood perfectly still, waiting for what came next. 2 police cars pulled up to the curb, their lights flashing but sirens now silent. Andrew stood completely still, his hands visible at his sides, clipboard still clutched in his left hand. He'd been in this situation before and knew exactly what to do: stay calm, move slowly, speak clearly. The woman who had called 911 immediately rushed toward the first officer who stepped out of his car. "Thank goodness you're here," she said loudly. "I found this man lurking around my neighbor's property. Mrs. Wilson is elderly and lives alone." Andrew noticed how she positioned herself between him and the officers, as if she was protecting them from him, rather than the other way around. The absurdity of it almost made him laugh, but he knew better. 2 officers approached, one older with graying hair at his temples who moved with the confidence of experience, and a younger officer who seemed more tense, his hand resting near his holster. The older officer spoke first. "Good morning, sir. We got a call about someone suspicious at this address." "Yes, officer," Andrew replied calmly. "I'm Andrew, owner of Greenleaf Landscaping. I'm here to measure and assess Mrs. Wilson's yard for a renovation project she hired me to do." He gestured slowly toward his truck. "That's my company vehicle right there." The woman cut in before the officer could respond. "He doesn't have any paperwork that proves he should be here. And Mrs. Wilson never mentioned hiring a new gardener to any of the neighbors." The younger officer stepped forward. Can I see some ID, sir? Of course, Andra said, reaching very slowly into his back pocket. My wallet is in my back pocket. I'm going to take it out now. He retrieved his wallet and handed his driver's license to the officer. I also have my business card and a signed contract with Mrs. Wilson in my clipboard here. He held up the clipboard but waited for permission before handing it over. The older officer nodded. May I see that, please? Andra handed him the clipboard while the younger officer radioed in his license information. More neighbors had come outside now, standing in small clusters on their front lawns, watching the scene unfold. Andra felt their eyes on him, some curious, others suspicious. So do you say Mrs. Wilson hired you recently? The older officer asked, flipping through the papers on the clipboard. Yes, sir. Last Tuesday. She wants a complete yard renovation. That's the signed contract, along with the designs we agreed on. Andra pointed to the signature page. I have a number if you'd like to call her, though she mentioned she had a doctor's appointment this morning. The woman scoffed. Convenient timing. The older officer gave her a look that suggested she should let them handle this. He turned back to Andra. This all looks in order, but we'll need to verify with the homeowner. Just then, the younger officer returned from the patrol car. His ID checks out. Andra Thompson, owner of Greenleaf Landscaping, registered business in the county for 3 years. The woman seemed disappointed by this information. Well, that doesn't mean Mrs. Wilson actually hired him. She would have told me if she was having major work done. We talk about everything. As if on cue, a silver sedan pulled into the driveway. A tiny, white-haired woman in her 70s stepped out, looking confused at the police cars parked near her house. What in the world? She said, grabbing her purse and hurrying toward them as quickly as her cane would allow. Mrs. Wilson, the woman called out, rushing to her side. Thank goodness you're all right. This man was on your property, and I was worried. What man? Mrs. Wilson asked, looking around. Then her eyes landed on Andra. Oh, you must be Andra. You're earlier than I expected. I hope that's not a problem. The relief that washed over Andra was almost physical, like cool water on a hot day. He smiled. Not at all, Mrs. Wilson. I wanted to get measurements before my crew arrives tomorrow. Mrs. Wilson looked at the police officers, then at her neighbor, her confusion growing. Can someone please tell me what's happening here? Why are there police cars in front of my house? The older officer stepped forward. Ma'am, we received a call about a suspicious person on your property. Your neighbor was concerned. Mrs. Wilson's expression shifted from confusion to understanding, then to anger in the span of seconds. Do you mean Andra? The landscaper I hired to fix this disaster of a yard? The neighbor tried to interject. I was just looking out for you. You never mentioned. I don't need to report my household decisions to the neighborhood committee, Linda, Mrs. Wilson snapped. And I certainly don't appreciate you calling the police on the nice young man I hired. The officers exchanged a look. The older one nodded to Andra. Sorry for the confusion, sir. Looks like everything is in order here. Andra nodded. No problem. You were just doing your job. As the officers prepared to leave, more neighbors had gathered, watching with interest. The woman, Linda, stood frozen, her face turning a deep shade of red. Mrs. Wilson watched as the police officers returned to their cars. The older officer tipped his hat to her before climbing in. Within moments, the patrol cars pulled away, leaving an awkward silence in their wake. She turned to Andra, genuine concern on her face. I am so sorry about this. If I had known this would happen, I would have told everyone in the neighborhood about hiring you. Andra gave her a small smile. It's not your fault, Mrs. Wilson, and it's not the first time something like this has happened in my line of work. Linda, the neighbor, stood awkwardly to the side, her phone now clutched tightly in her hand. The small crowd of neighbors who had gathered weren't dispersing. Instead, they moved closer, curious about what would happen next. Well, Linda said, her voice strained, I was just being cautious. You can't be too careful these days. Mrs. Wilson turned to her, leaning heavily on her cane. Despite her small frame, there was nothing frail about the look she gave Linda. Careful? Mrs. Wilson repeated. What exactly did you think was happening here, Linda? Did you think this young man was robbing me in broad daylight with a landscaping truck parked right in front? Linda flushed. I didn't see any truck. It's right there. Mrs. Wilson pointed toward Andrew's truck with its Greenleaf Landscaping logo. Are you telling me you called the police without even looking around properly? An older man from 2 doors down stepped forward. He had been watching the whole scene unfold from his driveway. That was wrong, Linda, he said quietly. You could have just asked the man what he was doing here before calling the cops. Linda's face grew even redder. I was looking out for our neighborhood. I don't know why I'm being treated like the bad person here. A woman walking her dog spoke up. Because you assumed the worst just by looking at him. That's not right. Mrs. Wilson shook her head. Linda, do you realize what could have happened? What if one of those officers had been having a bad day? What if Andrew had made one wrong move? You put his life in danger because you couldn't be bothered to think for 2 seconds before calling 911. Andrew cleared his throat, uncomfortable with being the center of attention. Mrs. Wilson, it's okay. I'd like to just get back to work if that's all right with you. Mrs. Wilson patted his arm. Of course, dear, you go ahead. But this conversation isn't over. She turned back to Linda. I've lived in this neighborhood for 40 years, and I've never been so embarrassed by a neighbor's behavior. Linda's eyes filled with tears, though it wasn't clear if they were from shame or anger. I was trying to protect you. No, Mrs. Wilson said firmly. You saw a black man in a place you didn't think he belonged, and you called the police. Let's call it what it was. A young woman who had been recording the scene on her phone spoke up. I got most of this on video. It's not right what happened here. Linda's eyes widened. You're recording me. That's invasion of privacy. We're on a public street, the young woman replied calmly. And people need to see what happened here today. Andrew, who had been trying to fade into the background, felt a mix of emotions. He was grateful for the support, but dreaded becoming some viral moment on the internet. He just wanted to do his job. Mrs. Wilson seemed to sense his discomfort. She turned to address the gathered neighbors. I think we've all had enough excitement for one morning. Andrew has work to do, and I believe the rest of you do too. The small crowd began to disperse, though many cast disapproving glances at Linda as they left. Linda stood frozen for a moment, then turned and walked quickly back to her house, slamming the door behind her. Mrs. Wilson sighed and turned back to Andrew. Now, where were we before all this nonsense? Andrew couldn't help but smile at the tiny woman's fierce demeanor. I was taking measurements for the new garden beds, ma'am. Well, don't let me stop you, and please call me Helen. After all this, I think we can skip the formalities. She paused. And Andrew? I'm truly sorry about what happened. He nodded. Thank you, Helen. That means a lot. As Mrs. Wilson headed inside, Andrew returned to his work, but he couldn't help noticing that the young woman with the phone was typing furiously on it. By the look on her face, whatever happened here wasn't going to stay in this neighborhood for long. He sighed and pulled out his measuring tape again. All he'd wanted was to do a good job on a big project. Now he was probably going to end up as another hashtag. By that evening, Andrew's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. The video had spread faster than he could have imagined. His wife watched it for the 3rd time, shaking her head as she sat beside him on their couch. I can't believe she called the cops on you for doing your job, she said, squeezing his hand. Actually, no, I can believe it. Remember when that security guard followed you around the home improvement store? Andrew nodded, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. Yeah, but this is different. My face is all over the internet now. He checked his phone again. Another message from a friend who'd seen the video. I just wanted to grow my business, not become famous for this. The video had gone viral on 3 different platforms. The young woman who recorded it had posted it with the caption, "Watch this lady call cops on black landscaper working in her neighborhood." It already had over 200,000 views, and the comments were filled with outrage. His business phone had been ringing nonstop too. Some calls were from people wanting to express support, others were from news stations looking for interviews. He'd turned it off after the 20th call. Have you seen the comments? His wife asked, scrolling through her phone. People are calling the neighborhood Karen country now. Andrew couldn't help but chuckle despite his unease. Poor Helen is probably regretting hiring me right about now. As if on cue, his phone rang. Helen Wilson's name flashed on the screen. Andrew took a deep breath before answering. Hello, Mrs. Wilson, I mean Helen. And, dear, I hope I'm not disturbing you. Helen's voice sounded tired but determined. I wanted to check how you're doing after today's situation. I'm okay, he replied, though okay wasn't exactly the right word. Just a bit overwhelmed. The video's gone viral. Yes, I know, Helen said. My granddaughter called to tell me I'm trending, whatever that means. She paused. I'm so sorry this happened to you. Linda had no right. Andrew leaned back on his couch. It's not your fault. Maybe not, but it happened in front of my house, to someone I hired. Helen's voice grew stronger. The neighborhood association is having an emergency meeting tomorrow night. They want to discuss what happened. Andrew felt his stomach tighten. Helen, I appreciate your concern, but I don't want to make this a bigger deal. It already is a big deal, Andrew. And not because of you. She paused. Would you consider coming to the meeting? You don't have to speak if you don't want to, but I think it would be good for people to see you as more than just that poor man in the video. Andrew glanced at his wife, who was watching his side of the conversation with interest. I don't know, Helen. Just think about it, Helen said. Oh, and one more thing. Several of my neighbors have asked for your business card. Apparently, they've been thinking about redoing their yards too. There was a smile in her voice now. Funny timing, isn't it? After ending the call, Andrew explained the situation to his wife. You should go, she said without hesitation, and take a stack of business cards. The next evening, Andrew found himself walking into the community center where the neighborhood association held their meetings. He'd never seen so many people at an HOA meeting before. The room was packed. When he walked in, conversation stopped momentarily, then resumed with more hushed tones. Helen waved him over to a seat she'd saved near the front. As he made his way through the crowd, several people nodded politely or smiled at him. Others looked away uncomfortably. The association president, a tall man with gray hair and glasses, called the meeting to order. I think we all know why we're here tonight, he began. An incident occurred yesterday that reflected poorly on our community values. Andrew noticed Linda sitting in the back corner, arms crossed tightly over her chest. She looked like she wanted to disappear. Before we discuss this further, the president continued, I want to introduce someone. Many of you saw him in the video that's been circulating, but he's more than just that moment. This is Andrew Thompson, owner of Greenleaf Landscaping and the professional Mrs. Wilson hired to renovate her yard. Andrew stood briefly, feeling awkward as all eyes turned to him. He hadn't prepared anything to say. He just nodded and sat back down. The president continued, what happened yesterday has prompted us to have some difficult but necessary conversations about assumptions, safety, and how we treat people in our community, whether they live here or are just here to do a job. A woman in the second row raised her hand. I think we need to be clear that what happened was racial profiling, pure and simple, and we need to make sure it doesn't happen again. Several people nodded in agreement. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. As the discussion continued, Andrew was surprised by how many people spoke up. Some shared their own experiences of being profiled, while others talked about times they might have made similar assumptions without thinking. The conversation was uncomfortable but honest. And through it all, Linda sat silently in the back, becoming smaller with each passing minute. 2 weeks after the incident, Andrew pulled his truck up to Helen's house to check on the progress. What he saw made him smile. His crew was hard at work, and the transformation was already visible. The overgrown bushes were gone, the new stone pathway was taking shape, and the garden beds were ready for planting. But something else caught his eye. 3 houses on the same street had his company's signs in their front yards. In fact, all across the neighborhood, he could spot 5 more Greenleaf Landscaping signs. His business had exploded overnight. He grabbed his clipboard and walked toward the house, waving at his workers. Roy, his newest employee, grinned and wiped sweat from his forehead. Morning, boss. Wait till you see what we did with the irrigation system. That corner flooding problem is fixed for good. Andrew nodded, genuinely pleased. He'd been able to hire 3 new workers with all the business coming in. The incident that he'd feared would ruin him had somehow done the opposite. As he made notes about the progress, he noticed Helen watching from her porch, a glass of iced tea in her hand. She waved him over. It's looking wonderful already, she said, handing him a cold glass of tea. My husband would have loved what you're doing with the place. Thank you. Andrew said, accepting the drink gratefully. The summer heat was intense today. Your neighbors seem to like our work too. He gestured toward the other green leaf signs on the street. Helen nodded, a knowing smile on her face. Yes, funny how that worked out, isn't it? I think some people in this neighborhood are trying to prove something. Andrew shrugged. Whatever their reasons, I'm grateful for the business. Helen's expression grew more serious. Have you seen the news this morning? Andrew shook his head. He'd been too busy coordinating his teams across their new job sites to watch TV. Linda's husband's company put out a statement. Apparently, she no longer works there. Andrew nearly choked on his tea. What? They fired her over this? Helen sighed. The statement said she chose to step down, but we all know what that means. After that national news segment aired, I guess they couldn't handle the bad publicity. The video had indeed gone beyond local viral fame. A major news network had picked up the story, running a 5-minute segment on racial profiling in wealthy neighborhoods. They'd used clips from the original video and interviewed experts on bias and community relations. They hadn't named Linda directly, but they'd shown enough of her face that anyone who knew her would recognize her. Andrew set his glass down, feeling a strange mix of emotions. I never wanted that to happen. I didn't ask for any of this attention. I know you didn't, Helen said gently. But sometimes these things have a way of forcing people to face uncomfortable truths. Just then, a car pulled up across the street, Linda's car. She hadn't been seen much in the 2 weeks since the incident. Rumors around the neighborhood suggested she was staying with her sister in another town until things died down. Andrew and Helen watched as she got out and walked quickly to her front door, keeping her head down. I almost feel sorry for her, Andrew admitted. Helen raised an eyebrow. That's very generous of you. More than she deserves, some might say. Andrew shook his head. Nobody deserves to lose their job and be run out of their neighborhood. I just wanted her to learn something from what happened. Before Helen could respond, they'd both noticed Linda walking back out of her house and heading straight toward them. Andrew tensed, unsure what to expect. Linda stopped at the edge of Helen's lawn, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She looked tired, with dark circles under her eyes. Mrs. Wilson, she nodded at Helen, then turned to Andrew. Mr. Thompson, I owe you an apology. The words seemed to cost her great effort. Andrew could see her hands trembling slightly. What happened that day was inexcusable, she continued. I made assumptions based on... She paused, struggling to find the right words. Based on how I look, Andrew finished for her. Linda nodded, her eyes downcast. Yes, and I put you in danger by calling the police when there was no reason to. I've had a lot of time to think about what I did, and I'm truly sorry. Andrew studied her face, trying to gauge her sincerity. There was something different about her. The entitled confidence was gone, replaced by what seemed like genuine regret. I appreciate your apology, he said finally. It couldn't have been easy to come over here. It wasn't, Linda admitted, but it's nothing compared to what I put you through. She glanced around at the landscaping work in progress. Your team does beautiful work, by the way. With that, she turned and walked back to her house, shoulders slumped but somehow looking lighter than when she arrived. Helen watched her go with a thoughtful expression. Well, I didn't see that coming. Andrew picked up his tea again. People can surprise you sometimes. Yes, Helen agreed, in bad ways and good. 6 months later, a warm autumn breeze rustled through the colorful plants in Helen's front yard. The space had transformed completely from the overgrown mess it once was. Neatly trimmed bushes with late-season blooms lined the new stone pathway, solar lights glowed softly as evening approached, and a small bench sat under the shade of an old oak tree, a spot where Helen often enjoyed her morning coffee. Andrew stood at the edge of the lawn, taking photos for his company's website. The yard had become something of a showcase for his business, and he wanted fresh pictures of it in the fall colors. Greenleaf Landscaping had grown so much that he now had 3 full crews working across the county. He'd even had to hire an office manager to handle all the calls. Getting Mike outside, Helen called from her porch, where she was arranging pumpkins and fall decorations. Andrew laughed. Just trying to capture how amazing these plants look with the fall colors. Well, come have some apple cider when you're done. It's my grandmother's recipe. She gestured to a small table where a thermos and 2 mugs waited. As Andra finished taking his photos, he noticed someone watching from across the street. Linda stood at her mailbox, sorting through letters. She gave a small wave when she saw him looking. Their relationship had evolved into something neither of them could have predicted 6 months ago. Not friendship exactly, but a mutual respect that had grown from an unexpected place. After her apology, Linda had kept to herself for several weeks. Then one day, she'd approached Andra when he was finishing up at Helen's house. "I've been thinking," she'd said, nervously twisting her wedding ring. "I want to do something more than just say sorry." What followed surprised everyone in the neighborhood. Linda had started a community group focused on addressing bias and building relationships between residents and the service workers who came into their neighborhood daily. The monthly meetings brought together landscapers, house cleaners, delivery drivers, and other workers with homeowners for conversations that might never have happened otherwise. Andra walked over to Helen's porch and accepted the mug of steaming cider. "This smells amazing," he said, sitting down beside her. "How was the school visit yesterday?" Helen asked, blowing on her own cider to cool it. Andra smiled. The previous day, he'd visited the local high school with 2 other business owners to talk about entrepreneurship. What started as a one-time speaking opportunity had turned into a regular mentoring program. It was great. 3 students signed up for spring internships with local businesses. One of them wants to learn landscaping with us. Helen nodded approvingly. "You've turned quite the negative experience into something wonderful for the community." Andra shrugged. "Sometimes life gives you unexpected opportunities." He looked across the street, where Linda was now walking back to her house. "Speaking of which, did you hear about the diversity training Linda's old company is now requiring?" Helen chuckled. "Yes, apparently they've hired a consultant to work with all their employees. Linda told me it all stemmed from the statement they put out after everything." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the neighborhood children riding bikes down the street. A delivery driver pulled up to a house down the block, and Andra noticed how the homeowner came out to greet him by name and offer a bottle of water, something that probably wouldn't have happened 6 months ago. "You know," Andra said thoughtfully, "when that video went viral, I was so upset. I thought it would ruin my business or turn me into some angry hashtag. I never imagined it would lead to all this." Helen patted his hand. "Sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best changes." Andrew's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from his wife, with a picture of a local magazine. The headline read, "Local landscaper turns viral moment into community movement." Below it was a photo of Andra standing with a group of high school students in green leaf t-shirts, planting trees in a community park. "Looks like you're famous for the right reasons now," Helen said, peering at the phone. Andra shook his head, smiling. "I'm just glad something good came from all this. That day could have gone so differently." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across Helen's beautiful yard, Andra thought about all the yards his company was now maintaining in this same neighborhood. Houses where, 6 months ago, he might have been viewed with suspicion were now displaying his company's signs proudly on their lawns. The incident that had seemed so awful at the time had sparked something unexpected, real change, both in his life and in the community around him. The transformation wasn't just in Helen's yard, it was in the neighborhood itself. "I should get going," Andra said, finishing his cider. "My son has a soccer game tonight." Helen nodded. "Go cheer him on." "And Andra, I'm proud of how you handled everything. Not everyone would have turned this situation into something positive." Andra smiled as he walked to his truck, which now had green leaf landscaping and community programs painted on the side. The original video still surfaced occasionally online, but now it was often shared as an example of how communities could learn and grow from confronting uncomfortable truths. As he drove away, he passed Linda walking her dog. They exchanged waves. A simple gesture that 6 months ago would have seemed impossible. It was a small sign of progress in a world that sometimes seemed to move too slowly toward change.